Welcome to another episode of The Dawn of Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and today is September 8th, 2009. And this is episode 323. For all of those of you who like plenty of information, you can read all about tonight's guest by going to www.exogenynetwork.com and clicking on the Live tab in the left-hand column. Now, I'm so glad that all of you have joined me tonight, as tonight's program is rather a special one for me. Over the years, many people have asked about my interest in paranormal topics and about my interest in extraterrestrials in particular. And sometimes they've been genuinely interested in why I've pursued this topic through the years. Often they've received answers that contain nothing more than a grain of truth as sort of a soothing balm to their sensibilities. Perhaps I'm guilty of being a strange sort of intellectual elitist. I saw no reason to ruin their illusions by supplying the whole truth, which they probably would neither appreciate nor understand. Tonight, not only do we have a fantastic guest, but I'm going to present you with a piece of the truth, a sliver of my personal history in conjunction with that guest. I was raised in a conservative rural community, a very small town, which has grown a little bit in the last 30 years since my departure right after high school. My family didn't particularly fit in, and despite my being a rather quiet and well-behaved child, I had a tendency to forget myself and blurt out observations that weren't well received by my teachers, such as the observation that my catechism lesson about communion seemed to refer to cannibalism, which led to my rather abrupt departure from the class. Since my family had no particular attachment to any religion, I had a reputation with my peers for being a misfit early on. I always felt like an awkward observer when attending the few services that I did attend with my friends. At the same time my disenchantment with religion was occurring, I wasn't being brought up without a sort of spirituality, a sense of morality, or even awareness of the Bible. Perhaps that made the trappings of the various denominations I would attend even more blatantly obvious to a child who sees things from a slightly different angle. Now, how did I have that different angle of observation? I'm not sure. Perhaps it had something to do with my siblings and I laying on the front lawn in the grass on a summer's night, and my mother pointing out airplanes and satellites and how they move through the sky, then pointing out the ones that defied the rules as UFOs. Perhaps it had something to do with our strange visitors that made periodic appearances. Maybe it had something to do with the incredible amount of poltergeist activity that occurred in a house with 3 kids navigating puberty simultaneously. Who knows? But as I sought explanations for topics forbidden to be spoken aloud even among ourselves, I encountered a book written by a man who lived about as far away from small-town Iowa as could be imagined, talking about ideas that fit my reality and explain the unexplainable, answering questions and allowing questions that have been forbidden for too long. I've been exploring ufology for over 30 years now, listening to people tell their tales, and I've heard some pretty bizarre ones. I've heard some very plausible ones that my instincts still told me were utter hogwash. I've seen things with my own eyes and heard things with my own ears that I know I wouldn't believe if someone told me that they had experienced it. Yet I know it was a very real observation, not induced by mental illness or chemical consumption. Few can convince me to tell some of those tales about those things that are just beyond belief because of how utterly absurd they sound when the story is told. I have many friends in various corners of that very broad field called paranormal, and I've often heard them talk of their particular heroes in their field, people that have inspired them, that they looked up to. In a sense, I always envy them for that sense of inspiration. The man that I would have to say that fills that role for me would have to be Erich von Däniken. Not only did he write those early books that allowed me to ask questions, that inspired me to continue challenging the so-called voices of authority, but this man that has continued in the face of adversity to dare to ask the questions and then suggest potential answers that don't always fit current popular theories. His first books were being published as I was learning to read and write, and yet he still writes on despite decades of accusations of being less than honest in his books. His latest book, History is Wrong, answers a few of those accusations. Tonight's guest is Erich von Däniken's representative in English-speaking countries, such as the United States, Giorgio Tsoukalos. Giorgio also edits the magazine Legendary Times, which Erich von Däniken is one of the founders and current writers for. So, Giorgio, you want to give the audience a brief introduction of yourself?
Wow, after this intro? What a great story. That's absolutely fantastic, and I really appreciate, your story is one of many. It always turns out I get asked, at conferences, or I'm told, it was Eric von Daniken who opened my eyes. It was Eric von Daniken that really sparked the interest, and so on and so forth. And the great thing is that, Chariots of the Gods was first published in the English-speaking world in 1970. So here we are, 40 years later, and it is essentially, an anniversary with the moon landing and so on and so forth. But also, what many people don't realize is that this is book number 28 that Eric has written since Chariots of the Gods. So, Chariots of the Gods started the whole thing, yet History is Wrong is book number 28, and, he's been researching this stuff now for 50 years, since he's been 25 years old, and it's quite amazing, the longevity and also how prolific that career has been.
Yeah, it is. And, even though I wouldn't say that he sparked my interest or that he was, the inspiration for the interest, he really was the one that took away that huge taboo about talking about it, because instead of having to put it in a personal reference, you could always say, well, did you read the book Chariot of the Gods? And then, the topic could be navigated with a less personal aspect, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, for me, it was something that moved the topic from the closet out into a public forum and took away all that taboo stuff, and, okay, we can talk about it now. And, it really did, I think it really was a catalyst that allowed this topic to move to where it is today.
Sure, absolutely, and we can never forget that it's, radio programs such as yours that actually allow for this information to reach the public. Yes, the internet is great and all this, but, the whole, idea that we are now able to have, multitude of programs similar to yours. I mean, 40 years ago, forget it. I mean, you mentioned taboo topics. 40, 50 years ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find any scientists who would admit that there is intelligent life out there. They would maybe do this under, behind closed doors, but it was a very taboo topic. Now, 40 years later, on the other hand, you'd be hard-pressed not to find any scientists who would disagree that there is intelligent life out there. The one taboo topic that scientists are struggling with today and flat-out refuse to talk about is the fact that not only are we not alone in the universe, but that they have been here, are here, and will always be here. And that is one of the main topics of History is Wrong, and also of the ancient astronaut theory, what the definition is, that a long, long time ago, Earth was visited by flesh and blood extraterrestrials.
Having worked with abductees for so very long, and, participated in many conversations with them about what the biggest issue facing an extra ET abductee, and basically is concrete physical proof of what is happening and has been happening. And, reading the book History is Wrong, I'm like, you know what, we've been looking all the wrong places for this proof, maybe. A lot of people go to, it's all about Roswell, okay? And I'm like, oh, that's 60 years old, nothing new's happened. Maybe we should look more currently. Or maybe we should just take that mirror, turn it around, and look into our own past. The truth we might have the concrete evidence that we've been craving for so long in our own history.
Oh, yes, of course, and the evidence is literally all around us. And, just from the very get-go, Legendary Times and Eric von Daniken and I, we are not in the same camp with some of those alternative historians who are saying that, for example, that the pyramids were built by extraterrestrials or by aliens. I mean, that's, in my opinion, absolute rubbish. Of course, the pyramids were built by our ancestors. The pyramids were built by human hands, sweat and blood. However, the ancient Egyptian texts are very clear in saying that the ancient Egyptians were the ones who built the pyramids, but with the assistance of the teachers from the sky, or the guardians of heaven. And those guardians of heaven, according to the ancient astronaut hypothesis, were flesh and blood extraterrestrials that our ancestors misinterpreted as being gods. And both you and I know there is no such thing as gods. Whenever I speak of gods, we always have to remind ourselves that it's a lowercase g. It has absolutely nothing to do with the spirit of the universe or anything like that. It's just that our ancestors didn't comprehend the technological aspects behind those visits, and thus they turned those flesh and blood, nuts and bolts, technological people into something divine, into something of magic and divinity.
Well, you take the average modern human, and just with what a woman would typically have in her purse, a man may have in his pocket, whatever, and transported them back, 3,000 years, a flick of the bic becomes an act of amazement.
Absolutely.
Things that are so simple to us.
Yes, and it's exactly what Arthur C. Clarke said, that any advanced type of technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that is exactly what happened here on planet Earth thousands and thousands of years ago. Because one thing we have to definitely point out, that, our ancestors, intellectually speaking, they were as smart as we are, as intelligent as we are today. The only difference is that their technological frame of reference was different to that what we have today. So it's not like our ancestors were dumb. But just like what you mentioned, if you could travel back in time with a Bic lighter, you would be essentially a god, because you can make fire with the flick of a Bic. I like that very much, by the way.
Well, just imagine going back in time with a car, okay? And or showing them, somebody from that era, a car. Okay, you have a magic talisman in your hand, and when you touch that talisman or push it into this magic wagon, it roars to life, and sending smoke out its tail, and then periodically you have to go see another magician who gives it a magic elixir, which provides it with the energy to roar even loud some more.
Absolutely.
So it's all done by magic, because
and there are hundreds of similar references all around the world in every ancient culture that exactly describe what you just said. I mean, all the ancient Chinese stories of dragons. Dragons did not exist. They weren't a living creature or a being. They were misunderstood technological machines with which the original emperors of China flew around in. And the ancient traditions are very clear in stating that the original Chinese emperors a long, long time ago descended from the sky in these fiery dragons with which they could reach the stars at any, moment's notice, and they used these dragons to fly around in and, just visit remote areas of the world, and it was always in contact with these dragons. Now, there is no way that these creatures existed in a biological form, but they were misinterpreted nuts and bolts machines that our ancestors thought were dragons or were biological entities. Now, the same thing has happened. If anyone says, well, that's absolutely crazy, well, the same thing has actually happened during the Second World War in the South Pacific, where ethnologists have come up with a term that's called cargo cult. And that was in and around the islands of the South Pacific, the Americans set up some makeshift bases there, and whenever they would land with their planes at night, the natives, they would sacrifice a pig on the bow of some of these planes, just to placate these metal birds of the sky. They had no idea what goes into, the machinery and the engines and so on and so forth. And so 10 years after the end of the Second World War, ethnologists went back to those islands to see what had happened to the native population, and much to their great surprise, the native population had made planes made out of wood and straw, recreating every night in ritualistic behavior the landing and the taking off of those wooden planes by talking into wooden walkie-talkies and having, rifles shouldered and things like this. I mean, absolutely incredible that something like this, happened in the 1940s, 1950s, and our contention is if something like this could have happened in the 20th century, why couldn't this have happened, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago? And, of course, it has.
Even a more closer to home, you might say, event that was similar to that was when the railroad crossed the Navajo Nation.
The fire horse.
Yeah. The descriptions of that, when you read that, you're like, wow, because it was a monster.
Well, sure, and it was called the fire horse. And also, the first cars, they were, the components of a car, the grill of a car was the mouth. The lights of the car were the eyes. And, so we have to remind ourselves that our ancestors didn't have the specific vocabulary needed with which to describe something or with which to name something. So the next best thing that they were able to do is call something a chariot of fire, or call something a magical stone, or, a magical tablet or something like this, because they didn't have the term computer. They didn't have the term aircraft, and so on and so forth. So, what we're doing here is that we are reinterpreting or looking at ancient history with a modern perspective, trying to figure out what is it exactly that our ancestors tried to tell us, for future generations to come, because they were very meticulous in writing down their history, and it's an insult in the face of our ancestors to say that all these ancient stories are nothing but fantasy, and that our ancestors were just sitting around a campfire conjuring up stories. I disagree with that arrogant attitude that we have today.
Yeah, we do. We are very, very arrogant, and our history is so selective.
Oh yes.
Even within just the United States, you get entirely different perspectives of various events, depending on which ethnic group, which, I guess, subculture would be the proper term, which geographic area, etc., that you get the history from. And then it's going to be entirely different from, you might say, the mainstream history that's typically published in a book. The events sometimes don't have much in common.
Yeah.
And so how can we expect ancient history to be any different?
Well, and this is why, Eric, with this book, there's a very specific reason why, the title was chosen, because in the end, right now, history is wrong. Because whatever we're being taught in school right now, whether it be, high school or even college, for crying out loud, not everything that our poor students have to learn right now is actual true. And, that is quite frightening that, not frightening necessarily, but disconcerting that, we have to have an alternative history field that makes way more sense than quote-unquote mainstream science. And here's the funny thing that, if you open a history book or any type of science book from, let's say, 200 years ago or even 100 years ago, none of the stuff that's in there is actually correct still. It's all been revised. It's all been, turned into something better. The theories have improved, and so on and so forth. And you know what? The exact same thing will happen with our textbooks that we have today. And 100 years from now, if you look at a textbook then, the only theory that will actually remain in there, and that turns out to be correct, is the ancient astronaut theory.
A lot of people say, well, that can't be true. Well, once upon a time, people claimed it can't be true. The world is round.
Mm-hmm.
Don't go too far out to sea. You're going to fall off the edge, and that's what sea monsters are. And I guess I got a different perspective of a lot of things reading the book History is Wrong. I had never considered the Mormon books in terms of historical documents. I read them, but, I was just like, okay, this is interesting, and going on. But, if you take it in terms of applying it to the overall world history, it takes on an entirely different context.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely, and especially, there are some of the references that you're talking about is where, they allegedly were able to build this boat that was impenetrable from water, and they had this artificial light source that was shining this weird green light, and the question remains: could it be that what is described in that ancient text is some type of a submarine? And the answer to that, of course, we'll never know. But at least we can surmise. At least we can try to think about it. But it is absolutely clear that there are descriptions of highly advanced technological entities, or not entities, but machines, objects that our ancestors described that we today can now look at from a modern perspective and try to figure out what is it exactly that our ancestors saw that they tried to describe in their ancient texts.
Yeah, and, if you want to bring it even to, a relatively closer piece of history, a lot of families within their own oral history have descriptions of things that were seen or heard about.
Mm-hmm.
That fall in the same category, and you listen to the stories and think, well, somebody was eating some bad rye bread, and go on, and maybe we're throwing out things, before we should. I used to tell my daughter all the time when she was growing up, don't close doors until you're sure that you don't want to go through them. And we're doing that all the time with information, that these legends and stories that, could be history and could be something else, we're discarding them as irrelevant before we know whether or not they are.
Yeah. No, and that is exactly it, that, we are too quick to dismiss something as, irrelevant, or we are too quick to dismiss something as it being fantasy, when in reality, if you have hundreds and hundreds of references of these humanoid-looking beings who descended to Earth a long, long time ago, then we should listen to that. We should pay some credence to this and try to figure out, well, what exactly did our ancestors describe here? What do they mean by the gods? Because mainstream archaeology, they're very clever, and that is, they ascribe any ancient site or any ancient ritual, they ascribe that to, this has to do with the worship of the gods. Case closed, check mark, that's it, moving on. And the great majority of mankind then nods and says, okay, yeah, I guess so. This was all done for the gods and, period. Well, see, this is exactly where the questioning has to begin, because the question then remains, well, what gods? Who were these people? Where did they come from? Because just to say, oh, this monument was built for the gods, that ritual is done for the gods, and then basically saying, oh, okay, now we know what it was for the gods. That is a very clever way of getting or of avoiding the true question. Because just to say, that's it, and moving on makes no sense, because we have to figure out who these gods were, lowercase g, and of course, in the ancient astronaut hypothesis, they were flesh and blood extraterrestrials who visited Earth thousands of years ago and essentially uplifted mankind, because one thing is crystal clear. We were munching on bananas in some caves, and then all of a sudden we are creating all sorts of magnificent monuments, and anything else that happened or followed later was not as sophisticated as our most early achievements. That is one thing that I really want everyone to think about, and to really, in front of your the eye of your mind. Anything, all the most ancient of monuments are built more on a monumental scale, bigger, more precise, more sophisticated. Anything that is younger, that followed that initial period of building, it's all rubbish. It's all much, much smaller stones, less sophisticated cutting technology. So, I mean, it's as if Ford's first model would have been the Ford Taurus instead of the Model T. That's what history is. And, according to the mainstream idea, history has followed an evolutionary process from point A to point P to point C and so on and so forth. But if you look at the true history, that is not how our evolution and technology took place.
Yeah, and sometimes I get the feeling that it was for the gods, a sort of academia's way of doing like our mothers so often did, because I said so.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. It's the same kind of answer. You're not supposed to question it because I said so.
Right.
Or you're not supposed to question it because it was for the gods. And I think back to, like in Arizona, there's Meteor Crater. The Hopis have a kachina called, in the English version, would be Star Chaser.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the impact occurred before there were supposed to be any people in North America at all. So why do they have a kachina associated with the stars and Meteor Crater? How did they know that's where this big hole in the ground came from?
Yeah, no, I mean, the Native American legends are also filled with references to star people. According to Native American myth, Earth was seeded by the star people. And by the way, every origin story, whether it be Native American or any culture in South America or in Australia, in Europe, in Africa, it doesn't matter. Every single origin story is exactly the same. They're all identical, and they all begin essentially that a long, long time ago, out of the vastness of the dark cold, which could be interpreted or translated as deep space, silver eggs emerged, cosmic eggs. And out of those cosmic eggs, a heavenly ladder was rolled down onto Earth, and down from that ladder descended these progenitors of mankind. And so, I'm all, for a great fantasy story, and I like to be entertained. But if you have thousands of identical stories from every culture in the world, whether it be, a huge culture or a small tribe somewhere, if you have thousands of identical stories, then logic dictates that you must stop and think, why? Well, how is that even possible? Because, it's as if, our ancestors all had access to the same type of information, as if some type of a Stone Age internet existed, which they could all access. But, we know something like that didn't exist back then. So what else was it then that they all of a sudden came up with the same stories? And I refuse the notion that, all of our ancestors, they were all just on drugs and they were smoking weed and peyote and they were drunk and so they had visions. And, those are all excuses. There are nothing else but excuses, because here is one cold, hard fact. You cannot solve an algebraic equation without first knowing the basics of mathematics, which means that there is no way you can come up with a story, no matter how drunk you are, no matter how much drugs you took. It's just not there. You need to have an initial spark of inspiration. And that initial spark of inspiration was this visit by extraterrestrials that basically kick-started the whole thing.
Yeah, for those of you who are listening, we're talking about Eric von Daniken's book, History is Wrong. And I have to admit, it's just as good as every other book, perhaps even better, because he goes back and covers some of the stuff that he's covered in previous books. He has more information, and hey, everything gets better with more research and time, right? So definitely go get that book and read it. It is absolutely enthralling. It makes you think twice and a third time. And getting back to where we were, I don't know how anybody can look at some of this stuff and say, oh, well, there's no way. A bunch of primitive people wearing straw sandals and carrying straw baskets filled with dirt built this pyramid or this hill or this whatever to worship the gods. Come on. People are practical. You have a few that go off on religious tangents, but in general, people only do things that benefit them in some way. We're basically a greedy lot, okay?
Yeah.
You're not going to invest generations in something that's not benefiting you somehow.
Yeah, and just to make to make it 100% clear that yes, all ancient monuments were in fact built by human beings, but with the clear distinction that they, according to their traditions and ancient legends, they had assistance from the gods. So, just want to make that clear. We do not subscribe to the idea that aliens built the pyramids. I think that's rather crazy, because that is not what the ancient texts are saying. The ancient texts pertaining to the pyramids are saying that King Zaurit built the pyramids with his people in order to preserve the knowledge of the universe that was given to him by the gods. And because there was an imminent flood, coming across all of Egypt, he said or asked the gods, what shall we do with all this knowledge, with these books that you've given me? And can we build a watertight building that could survive this deluge? And the gods looked at each other and just said, sure, that's a very great idea. And then it says, like I've mentioned before, King Zaurit, along with his people, built the pyramids along with the assistance of the guardians of the sky. And, what technology they had, heaven knows. But what is clear is that this technology was extremely sophisticated, because, for example, inside the Grand Gallery, inside the Great Pyramid, you have these gigantic pieces of stone, and each stone has a natural grain to it, the grain that goes along, like a vein inside the stone. And so whenever you cut something, you lose some of that material. Now, inside the Grand Gallery, inside the Great Pyramid, and I've seen this myself, the grain continues from piece to piece as if it was just cut with a very thin butter knife. I mean, it's unbelievable. There was no loss of material anywhere. Now, right there, that is something we cannot replicate today. Or we can, actually, but it's a very elaborate process, and we're having difficulties doing this today. And they allegedly did this with ropes and pulleys 5,000 years ago. I don't think so.
Ropes and pulleys and log rollers and bunches of slaves and, you know...
You know, and the thing is also that, you know, the whole wooden roller idea, we've all been kids. We've all played in the sandbox. We all know how difficult it is to maneuver around in the sand. So many of these blocks of stone that were used in ancient Egypt are many hundreds and hundreds of tons. Some of these blocks are as big as railway cars. And those were put on wooden rollers and pulled through the sand. I mean, not only would have the wooden rollers been crushed underneath the weight.
Too. I read someplace they were using boats too, and I'm like, how in the, you know, that must have been one big boat to haul that rock.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. So the bottom line is that some type of sophisticated technology was used. That technology has been lost in the meantime. And, you know, it serves us best to investigate this, you know, even closer, because contrary to popular belief that has been, you know, disseminated by the mainstream, no mysteries, especially in regards to ancient Egypt, for example, has been solved. Totally unsolved. I mean, there's absolutely no true answer.
Well, I've read some of the strangest explanations of how they built the pyramids. One involved this elaborate arrangement of building these containers and then filling them with sand and counterweights, and I'm like, geez. Not only were they hauling the rock,
and that was all done in 22 years, which means you know, you have so and so many millions of blocks of stone. If it was done in 22, 23 years, they would have to cut, dress, transport, and put in place a gigantic piece of stone every 9 minutes. I mean, 24 hours, by the way, for 24 years. I'm sorry. No, forget it. I mean, logic dictates not possible. Unless, of course, you had some type of technology with which you could, you know, alleviate or speed up the process.
Yeah, and sometimes I just wish that we really could have a time machine. Because I'd like to go back and see, how do they really do that? You know,
that would be fun, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, you know, there's so many things I would like to go back and see. You know, why did they do that, and how did they do that? I was a why kid, and I've just never grown up, I guess. You know, I want to know why. Why?
So if you had an opportunity, which time period would you go first? Would you go back first?
Would I go back first? There's so many appealing eras and continents. You know, I'd like to go back to the early days in Central America and see what was going on and why then. Mm-hmm. You know, what did they misinterpret and eventually evolve into sacrifice of human beings? You know, something was misinterpreted.
Yes,
you know, you and I both know that the sun's going to rise whether or not we're sacrificing human blood or not.
Yes, absolutely.
That's not going to change. So they misinterpreted something, you know, because... you know, were one of these creatures that were being interpreted as gods somewhat psychotic and like tying upon human flesh? Where did this story come from? Where did this idea come from?
Well, you know, I'm very glad. By the way, will we have to break at 6 o'clock?
Yeah, we'll be breaking in about 10 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. So very interesting that you should mention that because, psychotics or not, the idea that if we make official contact with extraterrestrials in the next 100 years or whatever, that everything will be hunky-dory then and everything will just be beautiful and pink and free love and, just everything will be great. I think that's a false hope because just like we have problems on planet Earth, there will be problems out there. There will be good species, there will be evil species. So you're absolutely right that who knows if one of those visitors from, 1,000 years ago in the Mesoamerican cultures was psychotic and did request for such peculiar rituals. Who knows? Because that is exactly, one of the downfalls of the whole alternative history field is that, all of a sudden when we make contact with ET, everything will be hunky-dory. And, while I would love for that to happen, I think that's a false hope. And false hope is the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of mankind. It's this false hope.
False hope is what led, wasn't it Cortez, when he first met the Mayan king and they falsely believed him to be the prophet the son of the god?
Exactly.
That was a misinterpreted thing, and the result is that the vast majority of them died within the first decade.
Yes, absolutely.
Culture was nearly completely erased in just a decade.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
We've made that mistake in the past. If we don't learn from our past, we are doomed to repeat it. And I don't know about you, I do not believe in true benevolence from extraterrestrials or humans, either one. I just cannot believe in that.
No, because in the end, I think ego, permeates the entire universe. Even though I do believe, and that is truly the word that I mean, believe, that in the end, good always outweighs bad. But to say that all extraterrestrials are benevolent, I mean, that's like saying, apples are oranges. They're not. It's just a false hope. And,
yes. My idea has always been, if extraterrestrials have been visiting this planet for thousands of years, have been meddling in the affairs of man, meddling in the genetics of man, then they expect it to pay off in some way. So what do we have that they want, that they couldn't take away from us 10,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, that they still want? It's got to be something very valuable to them.
Yeah.
And I really think it behooves us all, whether you believe in abductions or not, to figure out what it could possibly be that we possess that is so valuable to them to invest thousands of years of effort in this little blue planet in the middle of nowhere in the universe.
Personally, I think it's less involved in that. I think it's just something they've done, and there's really no return, because I don't know, have you ever seen the movie Contact with Jodie Foster? When she asked...
Actually, I did.
The alien, she asked the alien at the very end, why are you doing this, or what is going on? And the alien answers and says, I don't know, we've been doing this for billions of years. And I think that is really the answer, that, because that's another thing, that, if we had something so valuable, or that in the end aliens would come here to devour us or to annihilate us.
Well, they could have done that much easier in the beginning, so that really would not be the answer.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. It would have happened already a long time ago. So, no, I don't think that is the case either. I just think that whatever is happening here on planet Earth happens out there on just a much grander scale. Why do we go to the movies on the weekends? Well, because, I don't know, for entertainment. So it's not like there is a real, heavy point behind why we go to the movies. We just want to be entertained. So, I don't think that we have something that they want. I personally, that is not my opinion.
Okay. And that could, it could be very well. I've often told people say, well, why are there crop circles? I said, it's the alien kid learning to run the blue gizmo.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's the point to it? It doesn't, whether it's a road sign or whatever, I mean, really, what is the point to it? I don't see one. It's pretty, okay.
No, I mean,
that's the point.
There is another hypothesis that actually sociologists have recently, and futurologists have recently established, well, not recently, but from the 1970s and 80s onward, where they basically proposed that the entire planet Earth, or the solar system, is not much more than a big experiment, a zoo experiment. It's called the zoo hypothesis. Anyone can go and Google this. If you Google zoo hypothesis, it basically says that planet Earth is like the San Diego Zoo, where, if they want to be entertained, they just go to planet Earth, to zoo planet Earth, and just to observe what's going on here. Now, I find that a highly intriguing theory, also because, they also have proposed that if we don't annihilate ourselves, then ultimately the reward will be to join that, Federation of Planets or whatever the heck is out there as our ultimate prize. And I think that, we might very well be on our way, unless, of course, we kill ourselves. And that will have absolutely nothing to do with the aliens, because we have to grow up first before we can make contact. Officially, of course.
Well, it is kind of, an ant farm on a grand scale. It's kind of a creepy idea at the same time,
I like creepy.
You like creepy, huh?
I like it.
In a sense, it is to think of yourself as, no more than an ant farm or a zoo exhibit. That's kind of, it's creepy on a strange level.
Sure, but it's also very interesting because I'm going to ask the audience this: have we all ever tried to seriously get in contact with a heap of chickens? And the answer is no. So right now, I'm sorry, we are the chickens. We are not worthy of any, higher communication with an extraterrestrial intelligence because, number one, we just don't get it yet, and number two, we are too violent, too dangerous, for them. I mean, with nuclear weapons and all sorts of crazy stuff and rockets and just, being, we ourselves, humankind, we're still killing each other on our planet. Until that stops, there is no way we will ever make contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, officially speaking, of course, because I don't think that once a society has the capacity of traversing the distances of interstellar space, that in their home planet they're still killing each other off. I mean, that's the one point that's holding us back from anything, that we are still killing each other here on our own planet.
Well, maybe something that we would kind of put it in perspective. Look at what happens when you try to integrate a chimpanzee into human society. We had that recent case where that woman on the East Coast was killed by a friend's chimpanzee.
Yes.
Or severely injured, one of the other. I don't remember for sure which way. But anyhow, it didn't work, obviously. And, we're kind of like chimpanzees of the universe. We can learn to make signs and we can learn to prance around in clothes and look very similar to them, but at the same time we're no more than chimpanzees. We don't really get it.
Yeah.
And we potentially could turn on our own handlers. So, folks, do hang on to that thought, though, because guess what? It is time for our break. Stay tuned to the Dawn of Shades, and we will be right back with more from Giorgio Tsoukalos. welcome back to the Dawn of Shades. I'm host Gia Scott, and once again, I would like to remind everyone to visit the website, www.exogenenetwork.com. You can sign up for the newsletter, wander around and explore the website. Let me know what you think of it. There are links there to take you to blogs, Twitter, and even Facebook. If you have a question that you would like to have asked, you can email it to me at giascott@gmail.com. I'm monitoring the email during the program with Giorgio Tsoukalos tonight, and I'm trying real hard not to miss anything. In addition, if you have joined the virtual auditorium, you can always send it to me in text, and I will try and get the question asked for you. Now, where were we, Giorgio?
Well, I mean, are there any questions that have come up so far?
Well, so far we've got a question. What do you think of the fact that some alien activity has demonstrated their ability to interfere with our delivery systems, or perhaps some fusion actions we may not have been privy to in anger? I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but that I think they're saying that, do you think aliens have interfered with modern activities of some sort, like our bombs and whatnot?
I have a very simple answer to that, and many people will not agree with that, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't know.
That's a good answer. You know, I love answers like that because it's totally honest, because if you don't know, why make up something?
Right, exactly, and that is, you know, something where it's just not necessary. Just because you're an expert doesn't mean you have to be an expert or that you have to come up with an answer to every question. Sometimes you really just have to concede and say, I don't know, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I don't know. And, you know, there's a time and place for fairy tales. I remember a long time ago, my son was like 3, and he was afraid of the full moon. I have no idea why, but it was scary to him. So we had this whole big story thing about the one-eyed moon monster, you know, and how the one-eyed, all the things that the moon, or that, you know, something in the sky would see in the passage of a day, you know, as it went around the Earth. And that was the answer to, you know, that question. But as adults, you know, fairy tales just don't work. That leads to things like man sacrifices of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and really that does. And that's something that you do see repeatedly in human cultures as they're deteriorating. They begin to do things like that, sacrifice human beings, to indulge in cannibalism, to turn in on themselves is sort of what you see in you know, ancient times. And that was always a sign of a degenerate society.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Are we doomed to go that route again?
Well, and this is exactly what I was saying where we left off right before the close of the last hour, where, see, right now the big thing is the whole 2012 question. What will happen at 2012? Well, you know, quite honestly, the quick answer to that question is absolutely nothing will happen in 2012, because it's basically nothing but Y2K 2.0. Y2K was nothing else but doom and gloom. 2012 is nothing else but doom and gloom. It's another opportunity for publishers to sell more books, to frighten people, and it's a way for religionists, for fanatics, fundamentalists, to, hail the coming of the end of days, the apocalypse, and all such absolute nonsense. So, you know, I'm asked, what do you think will happen 2012? Like I said, I think that absolutely nothing will happen. By the way, Eric von Daniken also thinks nothing will happen. But then I'm asked, well, could you think that maybe, just maybe, 2012 marks the time when we will make official contact? And sure, I've thought about that scenario, I've thought about the idea, but truth be told, like I said at the very towards the end of the last hour, until we human beings are killing each other on this planet, there will be absolutely no chance that we will make official contact with any extraterrestrial entity, because, like I've mentioned before, I think that there is a vast amount of civilizations out there, and I would suggest, or I would surmise to say, that whatever we see now in Star Trek or in Star Wars, that pretty conceivably could be just how it is out there. Now, the one thing that we have to be very clear about is that on all of those planets that we see in Star Wars and in Star Trek especially, once a civilization goes out there and interacts with other civilizations, that only occurs after one particular thing has happened, and that is after they've stopped killing each other on their own planet. You don't see the Romulans fighting the Romulans, the Klingons fighting the Klingons, Earthlings fighting Earthlings. It just doesn't happen. So I really think that is this awakening that we need, where we realize not only are we not alone out there, but we are from planet Earth. We are all brothers and sisters. We are all in this boat together, Earth being the big, gigantic blue ball boat, that, if we really would like to advance ourselves, first things come first, and that is we have to respect each other despite of race, of ethnic heritage, of culture and class and society levels and what have you. I mean, all those things are purely secondary, even though we, or mainstream society, thinks that what car you drive and how much money you make is the most important thing above all else, and that is just false. It's so wrong. It's not even wrong. Let's put it that way.
Well, it shouldn't even be on the table. I mean, we really need to get over it already.
Yes.
A portion of society does see that. But sometimes, I'm reading about this, and Eric talks over and over again about these ancient texts that are, at this point, still indecipherable. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows what they're saying. Nobody knows what the characters mean. Nobody's put all this material together, really. You have this piece, and you have that piece, and, there's not been a coherent attempt to take all of this stuff and, interpret it cohesively. So you've got this material, and you've also got these repeated statements in various texts about how knowledge has been put aside for future generations. And that, essentially prophesizing about when we will obtain and be able to read this information. Maybe 2012 is merely about that. We simply get to read it finally. The book is being released in 2012. It would be so nice if we could just get the knowledge that once upon a time was there.
Yeah, no, I mean, very interesting what you're referring to, that, that some of these texts have not even been translated yet, and that is absolutely true. I mean, the one thing that, talks about that specifically in the book, History is Wrong, is the Voynich manuscript. And the Voynich manuscript is this very, very interesting piece of literature, or this piece of work that was found by a New York book antiquarian, Mr. Voynich. And he looked at that thing, and it has a script that to this day, 2009, has remained completely indecipherable. Nobody knows what it says. It has these very bizarre drawings inside, some of which are recreated or reproduced in the pages of History is Wrong. And the original of the actual object, or the actual book, is currently at Yale University, yet Yale University has decided not to determine how old the vellum or the paper is on which this text was written. Because, see, a few years ago, back in the late 90s, they sort of, or so they say, or so they think, or so they look at this whole situation, they sort of fell on their face by dating the Vinland map. And it turned out that the Vinland map was a forgery. It was a modern-day forgery. The ink that was used was modern. So they determined, well, it's a forgery. Well, and here they are. They are now in possession of the Voynich manuscript, and it would take them a couple of months to determine whether, yes or no, this is indeed genuine. Have they done it? No, they have not. And I don't think that that is how science should be conducted. Because if you have the opportunity to date something, which vellum or paper you do, or papyrus, you have the opportunity to do this because it's an organic material, go for it. Do it. It doesn't matter, really, if the Voynich manuscript turns out to be a fake. It really doesn't matter. So we can just, throw that thing out and move on to the next piece of evidence. But to just leave it in the dark, I think that is highly disconcerting that something like that is happening in 2009.
From what I understood, that particular manuscript could be a reproduction of an older manuscript.
Of course.
So even if it turns out to be 200 years old, it could in fact be a copy of a 2,000-year-old document.
Of course, and what you're referring to is absolutely proven in what's known as the Piri Reis map. And the Piri Reis map is from this Turkish general who said that he had gotten this map, he had this map made, but the source material for this particular map was from much, much older maps. And what's really interesting on that Piri Reis map, which dates to 1561 or 1361, the exact date escapes me at the moment, on that map you see the outlines of Antarctica as it was without the cover of the ice, which is miles and miles thick of ice. Underneath there, you have a rock landmass that we've only determined in the 60s what it looks like with ground-penetrating radar. Yet this map is over 500 years old, and it shows the outline of that landmass to a T. It is perfectly detailed, and so that is exactly what happened. That Piri Reis manufactured or drew this map. His cartographers drew this map with the help of much more ancient maps that he had that were at his disposal. So the question is, how the heck did people over 600 years ago know what the outline of the land masses underneath the ice caps looked like in Antarctica? It's an absolute impossibility unless, of course, you take the alternative history perspective, how you view the world.
600 years ago, didn't they still, most mainstream maps had the edge of the world drawn with the sea monsters?
Yes.
I was thinking that was so. So, there again, there's another document that you can't help but question. One thing that must make Eric absolutely crazy is the documents that, according to legend at this point, practically, are in the possession of certain governmental types of entities where nobody has access to them.
Sure, but you know what? At least, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but at least they're safe there. Yale University will not make that thing disappear. Yale University will not destroy the Voynich manuscript. So if those items are, in quote-unquote reputable institutions, in some ways that's a good thing. And of course, I totally understand what you're saying, that, unfortunately, we don't have access to it.
To have all these documents from when the conquistadors were first coming to America. I'm like, well, what do they say? Well, nobody knows. Nobody's had access to them for how long? Are they still there? I don't know. Or do you know? Does anybody know?
Well, see, unfortunately, thanks to Christianity when the conquistadors arrived in Central and in South America. They considered, especially Central American Mayan culture and Aztec culture, they considered those codices. One book was called a codex. Two books were called codices. It's a plural of codex. They considered, and there were hundreds of thousands of these, pieces of paper that contained the Mayans' history. They considered that, the conquistadors considered that the work of the devil. So hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these scrolls were burnt in fires. I mean, absolutely inexcusable. The great library of Alexandria in Egypt, fire, destroyed because it didn't fit into the current religious ideas and didn't jive with the current accepted theories. I mean, it is absolutely disgusting what we have done in history by destroying ancient history, documents of ancient history. And so today, there is only a handful of Mayan scrolls that have survived, or at least that we know of. I think there's only about 16.
I have to, thinking, even to myself, okay, my mother said I have this thing about books from birth. I couldn't tear them or scribble in them, And, as somebody who spent their life taking care of these books, essentially an ancient librarian or ancient scholars, they would have squirreled away what they could have. They would have hidden them away. And, so you can't help but wonder, did a few of them survive and are hidden away someplace and are still safe?
I am sure.
You can hope.
I am sure, absolutely. Because there are stories like that. There are ancient traditions and ancient legends that speak just of that. I mean, I was just talking about, Central and South America. I mean, to this day, we have these magnificent stories of this lost city called El Dorado. I mean, the new Indiana Jones movie was about that. I mean, that Indiana Jones movie was not based in flights of fantasy. I mean, that was based on real events, that in South America there exists a lost city called El Dorado that allegedly is made of gold and contains not only treasure from a materialistic standpoint, gold and diamonds and precious metals and all this, but also treasure in the form of knowledge. So hundreds of people have lost their lives in an attempt to reach El Dorado, and hundreds of people have disappeared. And the disappeared ones, we don't know if they died. So what if they did find El Dorado? What if they're still alive? I mean, obviously this is all, now that, I am the first one to say, that is all total speculation. But it's a great story, and it's definitely worth, pursuing further. I mean, it's a great adventure story.
You think about it, how quickly does the jungle, even for flights over it, people that are doing geographical surveys and whatnot, how quickly does the jungle actually swallow up things?
Oh, very fast.
So they're doing their flyover, they see nothing more than maybe a few huts for the people that are still living there, a few fields, nothing of interest, and so they go on.
Oh, sure, absolutely, and the canopy is so dense that, sometimes the light doesn't reach through. So, you're absolutely right. I mean, the jungle, eats up everything in its path, everything.
Well, I know even how quickly vines and everything eat up things here in Louisiana. I can only imagine what a jungle would be like. and things are quickly covered by vines. We're continually fighting them, reclaiming New Orleans itself. They're grabbing at fences and everything else.
Right.
It doesn't take long, even in a subtropical climate, for the local flora to reclaim to what it once was.
Right. Yes.
So you think about that, and we've all heard stories about the magnificent things that were found in Southeast Asia, another jungle place with a very old culture.
Mm-hmm.
And, then you see pictures of these cities that, they have amazing things, and yet the people left, and it was swallowed up by the jungle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And see, the crazy thing about, South America is also that, and this is one thing that Eric talks about in the new book, History is Wrong, that there is this underground system of tunnels in Ecuador. And
I found that story absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and so what happened is that Eric first came out, or first presented this story 35 years ago in 1974 in his book called The Gold of the Gods, which turned out to be probably his most controversial title that he ever wrote. And after that book was published, he was labeled a charlatan, a huckster, a fraudster, an inventor of stories, and just, the press was not very positive towards him. And so after 35 years, he has now written History is Wrong, and one huge chapter inside the book is basically an exact retelling of exactly what happened 35 years ago at those caves in Ecuador, where not only does he describe what happened, but he also reproduces correspondence letters that he had with the people in charge back then, including Neil Armstrong, who was quoted in the paper of saying that, Eric von Däniken lied about these caves, and Eric von Däniken wrote to Neil Armstrong, and he said, "Hey, Neil, what are you talking about?" To which Neil Armstrong wrote back, and he said, "I never gave an interview like this. I never even said anything like this. So rest assured, they were lying. I never gave that interview." So all this intrigue, all this crazy stuff happened, and in 2006, this gentleman by the name of Stanley Hall, he published a book called Teos Gold. And on the front page of that book, he revealed the exact longitude and latitude of that cave system that Eric visited back in 1974. And because now the exact location of that cave was released, Eric was like, all right, now I no longer have to keep my mouth shut. I can tell the story exactly as it happened, because now everyone knows where the caves are. So basically, this book is Eric's vindication from stories that were presented or written 35 years ago, and they all turn out to be 100% correct, and then some.
Yeah, I found that section absolutely intriguing because, like everybody else, I'd heard about how Eric had, been discredited because he was such a charlatan and he'd faked his investigations and his studies and yada, yada, yada. And, you're like, well, you know what? Some of this stuff isn't fake. And
none of it is fake.
Fake.
None of it is fake.
This is, I'm thinking 30 years ago, I'm much younger, and I'm like, no, it's not all fake, so, it was interesting to see a response, see the specific accusations and his response to it.
Right.
And, I found that very, very interesting because did I see all these newspaper reports and magazine articles and so forth that occurred in Germany and other places? No. Did I know the whole story? No. You heard half-baked information, And that's how rumors does its real damage.
Right.
It's somebody said, or, it's going to be something vague that you can't really respond to. And this, was really an eye-opener for me to see how this story played out from his point of view.
Well, and here's the interesting thing, to which ties it all together. I mean, there's a reason why he wrote about Teos Gold Library and why he wrote, for example, about the Voynich manuscript. And as we've established earlier in the interview here, the Voynich manuscript still to this day cannot be deciphered, or has not yet been deciphered, the script of it. And there are these metal plates that Eric saw as he visited this old father, this man of the cloth by the name of Father Carlos Crespi. And Carlos Crespi had this collection of thin metal plates, folios, that were all, covered, gold-plated, and they looked like gold. And Eric is not even sure if all of these pieces were actually all made of gold, or if they were just electroplated or anything like this. But on those objects were very interesting symbols and very interesting scenes and sceneries, and some of which are very similar, if not identical, though, to what can be found in the Voynich manuscript. So right there we have a correlation that nobody talks about, that nobody looks at, and it takes someone like Eric von Daniken or Legendary Times to raise the question and ask, what is this? What is going on here? Could there be a connection? And of course, sorry to say, and no, I'm not sorry, of course there is some type of a connection. Just what? We have to, put all of our heads together and, merge our intellect and, crack the code. Solve this thing, get the key.
Yeah. That key, I guess that key intrigues me.
Good.
It's been such a common theme. I've heard so many stories from abductees about the symbols that they've seen, the writing that they've seen, things that are shown to them in patterns over and over again. And, they'll say it doesn't look anything like our writing. And, occasionally you'll get one of them to draw a few of the symbols, and it's like, I don't know what that means.
Well, there is some homework for you. If you have some of those symbols, compare them to some of the reproductions of the Voynich manuscript inside Eric's new book. I mean,
some of these abductees that have talked about these symbols that I'm still in contact with, I'm going to have to get them to look at that and say, have you seen any of these before?
I mean, that is right there. I mean, this is really something highly fascinating.
Yeah, because I didn't know about the Voynich manuscript. I'd never heard of it until this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I read about it, and it recurs, it's a recurring thing in the book, and it was, so interesting. And I guess I'd never thought about all these symbols that, they talk about in terms of an ancient document, comparing them. Or being able to say to one of them, can you look at this and tell me if you've seen these symbols before, or maybe know what they mean? And, that's an interesting idea.
Well, and the Voynich manuscript is one of many ancient documents that we have that, have yet to be deciphered. I mean, another very famous script that has yet to be deciphered is on what's called the Disc of Phaistos. Phaistos is on the island of Crete in Greece, and it's this round disc, almost, it looks like a discus that you use at Olympia. And on that discus, you have a spiral that goes into the middle, almost like a shell, and there's these symbols that go towards the center, and these are very interesting looking symbols. They obviously mean something, but to this day, and here this thing has been discovered 100 years ago, nobody has a clue, not even the slightest clue, what any of it means, because we have not yet found, the corresponding Rosetta Stone that they found for ancient Egypt, for example. Has not happened yet. Neither for the Phaistos disc nor for the Voynich manuscript. So, anyone who's listening, if you're a treasure hunter, that's your homework for there.
Yeah. Now, I did have a question from the virtual auditorium.
Yeah.
What about all of the metal books in the collection of Father Crespi in South America? Have these been documented? Have any of them been translated?
Documented, yes, 100%. Translated, no. And to add to the question, many people are saying, or especially the debunkers and the critics, well, you know, all of this stuff was a forgery and worthless junk that the local population, you know, created in between the 50s and now. Well, I have to disappoint the debunkers and the critics by saying that when Father Crespi passed on, within hours, the State Bank of Ecuador was at his doorstep, and they requested to have many, many parts of that collection in order for it to be displayed at the State Bank in Quito, Ecuador, where this collection still today can be looked at. So right there, that renders the debunker's argument null and void, because a state bank would not show up if those pieces were indeed forgeries and fakes and worthless. I mean, you know, you only need to have half a brain to understand some of these things. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, even though we're talking about rockets and space travel here. You know, it's very easy to figure out what's going on. I mean, these pieces were not worthless, because otherwise the State Bank would have not showed up. They would have not shown up immediately to seize the property in order for it to be safe and to be displayed at the State Bank in Quito.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Now, as far as the translation goes, nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Has there been attempts to translate it?
Of course. Just like there has been attempts made for translating the Voynich manuscript and also the script on the Festos disc, but nothing definitive, unfortunately.
Well, you know, you read about on the like the Voynich manuscript. You know, you read about the recurring characters. Recurring characters. You know, if this was somebody who had eaten some bad rye bread or was smoking some weeds from the woods, you know, creating recurring characters just doesn't sound, especially like the one you talked about, or they talked about it reappearing 1,300 times. Okay, that's a little repetitious even for, you know, smoking wildwood weeds, you know?
Yes, absolutely.
Or even being nuts. I mean, whatever you want to, you know, subscribe it to, you know, fabrication, fantasy, whatever, that you don't see that kind of repetition.
Right.
You know,
to that extent.
Yeah, you know, it means something, but what it means, we don't know yet.
Mm-hmm.
And another question from the virtual auditorium, though.
I love the virtual auditorium. This is sweet.
Yeah, well, yeah, it comes up in text, and I can see it, and so now they're getting questions. Now that we're getting down to the last few minutes of the show,
excellent.
They're popping up with their questions. Crystal skulls, are they real or fake?
They're absolutely real. They're absolutely real. Anyone that says that the crystal skulls are fakes, which the mainstream archaeologists have been doing, especially since the new Indiana Jones movie came out, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the question about the crystal skulls has not been solved. And yes, there are 2 to 3 crystal skulls that have indeed been made in the 20th century. There is no question about that. But for example, the most famous of all the skulls, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, is ancient, and no one knows how it was made because it was cut against its grain, and anyone without sophisticated technology could not do that because crystal would shatter. if you go against the grain of the crystal, it would immediately shatter, which obviously that particular piece did not. And in the 1960s, when that skull was brought to the laboratories of Hewlett-Packard, who even back then had the most sophisticated technologies because they were just getting into the whole computer business, they actually made tests, conducted tests on that crystal skull, and I quote, the Hewlett-Packard scientists said, and again I quote, "This thing should not exist." Well, why doesn't anybody talk about that quote from Hewlett-Packard, from crying out loud? It's not, from, they didn't get the quote from some homeless bum on the side of the street somewhere. No, it was Hewlett-Packard, a reputable computer firm, and if scientists of that firm go on record for saying something like that, and that is just conveniently brushed under the carpet, I mean, that is just, it's flabbergasting that something like this is going on right now. So yes, the crystal skulls are 100% correct, and legend says that there are 13 life-sized crystal skulls around the world, hidden away at various spots all around the world, and if they're brought together in a time of crisis or in a time of need, then the knowledge of the universe would be revealed. Problem is that those crystal skulls, the ones that have been found, are only a portion, and there's maybe 5, 6 that have been found. The other 8 are still missing, and according to legend, they are all kept under guard by native populations, and they know that we are not ready for those skulls to come together. We're not ready for that knowledge because we are still killing each other.
Early on in the program, I mentioned intellectual elitism, and a lot of people think that's a modern concept, but it's not.
No,
it's a very ancient one. You don't give knowledge out to the general population because they're not ready for it. They have no use for it. They cannot understand it because they don't have the foundation on which to base their understanding. It's not a new idea. This is a very, very ancient one. There's always been small groups of a population that possessed the vast majority of the knowledge.
Yeah.
I wonder what knowledge is actually contained, and how is it contained in these crystal skulls?
Well, people have suggested that these crystal skulls, they, act as some type of a computer because crystal technology is actually used today in every home computer. Any computer in the world right now contains crystal technology that stores all the information that's necessary so that we can have computers. The problem is that with the crystal skulls, even if they are computers, unfortunately, we don't know where the on switch is. so that's because you look at the thing and there's no button. There's no how they get turned on. That's neither here nor there. But that's also another question. I mean, is it a mental telepathy or anything like this? We don't know.
So many, many questions and so few answers. There's a big why. Why does it work that way? I wonder, how could knowledge, like, the legend supposedly indicates that these skulls have, how could it be contained in these skulls, and then how can we extract it? Bring 13 of them together and we suddenly have some spiritual revelation that leads us to the knowledge? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you'd be surprised. Again, those skulls are from another world. They're from another planet. So, who knows what those crystal skulls are capable of? I don't know. You know, I personally, I have my doubts, but at the same time, I am the first one to say that if there are ancient myths, we should look at those and try to figure out what it is exactly that our ancestors tried to tell us. And so that is the story with the crystal skulls, that they were brought here from 13 worlds, from 13 different planets, by the Star People, otherwise also referred to as the Kachinas, as you've mentioned earlier in the program. So that, you know...
That 13 is such a recurring number. 13 tribes of Israel, 13 clans of...
Oh, it's a sacred number, yes, absolutely.
You know, it does. They always talk about the 13, and there's always a lost one.
And there's the 12 apostles and Jesus, 13, right there.
Right.
You know, so, I mean, 13 is a, like you said, a very reoccurring number, and it's a sacred number, and, you know, also multiples of 13 is sacred as well. So there is something to it. What it is, that is the great adventure. That is the great journey of figuring it all out. This is what makes life exciting. You know, I mean, sure, you know, I love watching American Idol, no question. But there is more to life than watching American Idol. And this is what really, you know, what the population should pursue to get this higher knowledge of, you know, that there's much more to the world than we think. It's not boring. It's so exciting to be alive right now. It's just crazy. I just wish the day would have more hours than just 24.
Speaking of more hours, we have run out of time.
Yes, see?
Yeah. You
see,
know,
those 2 hours just went by like crazy.
Yeah. A lot of people say, well, 2 hours is a long time. I'm like, you'd be surprised how quick it passes.
Very quick.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Giorgio Tsoukalos, for coming on tonight and being such a wonderful guest. I've had a ball.
Thank you.
I
you
hope
should definitely...
everyone else in the audience has as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hope we can do this again. And the website where you can find out more is legendarytimes.com. If you're interested in purchasing the book through Eric's personal website or a personal bookstore, that's legendarytimesbooks.com, and you'll support our research, which we would very much appreciate. And if you go on legendarytimes.com, I will send you a free copy of Legendary Times for just having listened to this program.
Hey, folks, you can't beat an offer like that. Okay, I hope the program tonight has provided everyone with plenty of food for thought and more illumination for your personal journey towards truth. Join us again next week as we bring you James Orrick, author of The Tryptamine Palace, and another fascinating episode of The Dawn of Shades. With that, we are out of time. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and good night.